the same type of actors who have recently wrecked our economy had wrecked the economy then. There was a worldwide depression caused by the gambling of the financial services industry. And urban workers were hurting, rural people were also really hurting. And at that point, about 54% of the population lived on farms. Today, only 16% of our population even lives in rural areas. So between 1930 and 1935, we lost about 1/6 of all farms. And so when the Roosevelt administration came into office in the early 1930s, one of the goals was not just to help urban workers, but to really help rural people. And so they initiated a number of public policies that many of the policies stayed in place until recent times. And amazingly, the first few days of the Roosevelt administration, they were actually able to pass a farm bill. Most of you probably know that generally a farm bill passes every 5 years. But back in the early 1930s, the Roosevelt administration, through that first farm bill and then through some other things that they did through the Department of Agriculture, made a number of changes that made it possible for farmers to actually make a living. They did common sense things, like take millions of acres of marginal land out of production. And in part, that was to help solve a lot of the environmental problems that were causing the Dust Bowl, but it was also because we shouldn't be growing on marginal land and overproducing crops. They started a grain reserve. China's had a grain reserve since about AD 54. And a grain reserve means that in years of bounty, farmers put the grains that they grow in a silo or silos on the farm. And then when there's a bad year, the grains are pulled out, and it helps alleviate high prices and famine. And actually, if we had had a grain reserve still in 2007, 2008, we may not have had several million people go hungry, and many died from the speculation that took place because there was no grain reserve in the United States, and the U.S. sets the price on grain around the world. But getting back to the 1930s, other things that the Roosevelt administration did was create some programs that actually made it possible for farmers to make back the cost of production, because that's one of the problems we have today. It's very difficult for farmers to be assured that they're actually going to pay back the bank after they grow crops. And, it's expensive to put in a crop, and most farmers have to borrow a lot of money. And they also initiated other programs, education programs, and a lot of other things that we don't have time to go into. But things that made it really possible for small, diversified farms to be profitable and make a living. And this worked really well through World War II. The U.S. actually produced food for all of the Allies during the war. And then after the war, when Europe was devastated and when all those colonial governments across the globe were falling, the U.S. continued to produce food. But not everybody was very happy with this situation where it actually worked for farmers to farm, where they could make a good living, and where rural communities were really vibrant. Because a lot of things had changed after World War II. First of all, the U.S. had become an industrial powerhouse, you'll remember. The center of finance had moved from London to New York. And there were a group of business leaders and political leaders that believed that the age of agriculture was over and that it was time to move all of those young men out of agriculture and into factories, especially in the north. And a number of these individuals got together and created a lobbying organization. And this organization worked with a lot of other economic interests like the Chamber of Commerce and some of the agribusiness associations. But this was an especially important organization in what happened to farming in rural areas. It's called the Committee for Economic Development, and it was started by people like Paul Hoffman, who was the president of Studebaker, one of the large car companies of the time, and some of his other colleagues in companies like Kodak Eastman. And these men got together, and they believed that there needed to be a resource organization where businessmen could get together, it would be kind of a merchant of ideas. They could hammer out their differences of opinion, and then they could come together and influence policy after they had agreed. And these men were working on various issues, from tax policy to agriculture, but we're focusing on agriculture tonight. And these men agreed about several things regarding agriculture. First of all, they had a long memory, and they remembered that farmers had been on the vanguard of populism. From the 1860s on, farm organizations, you'll remember, had been fighting the banks and the railroads and advocating for their communities, and were pretty politically powerful through many different organizations. And in some places they elected candidates, they worked with labor and other constituencies, and they built a power base. And these business leaders remembered that. And they also believed that there was a need for cheap labor to run the factories and to create the kind of country that they believed was going to be more profitable. And, you know, I'm not saying that these were evilly intended men. I think they were technocrats. This was in their economic interest, and they believed that this was progress. So they got together and they formed this Committee for Economic Development, which became very influential. During the first 15 years of its existence, 38 of its members held public office, and 2 of its members were actually Federal Reserve Bank presidents. And they began to make progress in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, progress in chipping away these New Deal policies. Now, during President Eisenhower's tenure, there was a Secretary of Agriculture named Ezra Benson. And Ezra Benson was pretty much of an ideologue. He believed that the New Deal agriculture policies were actually leading the country down the road to communism. You'll remember this was the McCarthy era, and everybody was seeing communists behind every tree. And so he began to use his power as Secretary of Agriculture to kind of reduce parity or the ability of farmers to make an income on par with urban people. Moving into the 1960s, the Committee for Economic Development had recruited most of the titans of industry, most of the economics departments in our most prestigious universities. It had recruited most of the most important institutions, from publishing houses to the new industry of television. And this gave it a very large voice. They put together a report with those economics departments called an Adaptive Plan for Agriculture. And you can actually still order it on the internet today. It was a plan that was organized around getting rid of all of the New Deal programs, the remaining vestiges of them, and it even talked about the need to globalize food production. And in fact, 2 years later, they wrote a report about global food trade. But this adaptive plan for agriculture was distributed widely. It was written up in newspapers, it was on television, members of Congress were talking about it, and there was a steady drumbeat now to get rid of these programs that actually made it possible for diversified family farms to make a living. And moving into the 1970s, you will remember that President Nixon was running against George McGovern for his second term. And the Vietnam War was going on, and there was a lot of controversy. And there was our Secretary of Agriculture, who was a protege of Ezra Benson from the 1950s. His name was Earl Butz. Some of you are probably old enough to remember Earl Butz because he was a real character. He would get on the television and pontificate. And remember, in those days, there were, in most communities, 4 channels, maybe a 5th channel. And when you sat down to dinner, you turned on the television and people watched the evening news. Very different world than the one that we live in today. And Earl Butz would be on the television pontificating about agriculture and the future. And he told farmers they needed to get big or get out. They needed to buy a lot of equipment, borrow a lot of money, buy a lot of land, that there was going to be a huge export market. And because he was Secretary of Agriculture, he got on the speaking circuit, and he told people that they were going to get rich. He told farmers that if they did this, they were literally going to get rich. And he put together a deal when President Nixon was running against George McGovern that was going to help re-elect President Nixon. And this was a grain deal. It was the only year in the 1970s that there actually was that export market. And the Soviet Union had a grain failure, so he conspired with the grain traders to do a kind of an illegal deal with the Soviet Union that sent most of the grain, or a very high percentage of the grain, to the Soviet Union. And in fact, the price of bread went up that following year. They sold so much of the commodity. The grain traders made several $1 billion, and President Nixon did get reelected, and they felt that this grain deal had helped turn farmers against the Democrats. So that was the only year, though, that there was any real export market for grain. But unfortunately, farmers did take Earl Butz's advice, and so what ended up happening? Well, there was no place to sell the tremendous amount of products that were grown, the commodities. And so we began to see farmers go out of business, because what happens when you borrow money and you have no crop to sell? Well, eventually the bank takes your place back. And that was really the beginning of the modern agricultural crisis that we're still in today. In the 30s, there were 6.8 million farms. We have under 1 million farms left today. The USDA uses a different number, but they're actually fudging the statistics. So, and I just want to say, Earl Butz did end up getting fired under President Ford. First, he went to Rome to a major food conference and made lewd jokes about the Pope. And then he was recorded making racial slurs, and President Ford inherited him and fired him. But he continued to stay on that circuit, speaking to farmers, giving them bad advice. Now, a number of different things began to happen in the 1970s that really changed our country. there was a real pushback against a lot of the progressive changes that had been made in the 1960s and a lot of the laws that had been passed in the early 1970s, many of them environmental laws. And there was a Supreme Court judge by the name of Powell who was appointed by President Nixon, who had been a corporate lawyer, and he wrote a memo to a friend of his at the Chamber of Commerce that it was 2 months before he was nominated to become a Supreme Court justice. And in this famous memo, he wrote about how corporations really needed to take notice of what was happening to public policy, and that they needed to start putting money into building nonprofit groups, that they needed to get involved in elections, that they really needed to start using their resources to turn around what had happened. And you can actually get the Powell memo on the internet today, too. It makes some pretty interesting reading. And by the way, Supreme Court Justice Powell wrote the first decision making a corporation a person. It was the First National Bank lawsuit where Massachusetts had passed a law saying that corporations couldn't put money into initiatives, ballot initiatives. And Supreme Court Justice Powell wrote the decision saying that that was a no-go because corporations are people too. So this had a real effect, though, on the strategy that companies, agribusiness, but a lot of other companies had too. And there were a lot of very deep-pocketed funders that began to put money into organizations that became the foundation of the right today. We all know about the Koch brothers today, right? But their father was one of the big funders. And this money went into starting institutions like the Heritage Foundation, Cato, Citizens for a Sound Economy, and dozens of others of right-wing nonprofit groups that get quoted in the media today. And these organizations and the corporate interests also decided that they needed to have a president who was more friendly to their political persuasion. And so agribusiness, the oil industry, and a number of other industries got together and raised the money that elected Ronald Reagan. And we all know that President Reagan came into office on a deregulatory agenda. But what we don't talk about very much are the details and the fact that one of the main things on that agenda was the desire to get rid of the antitrust laws in this nation. And those are, of course, antitrust laws are the rules and regulations that prevent companies from becoming monopolies, merging and acquiring one another and stopping competition. And we all know that rhetorically, we have an economy that is supposed to be based on competition, right? Well, what happened under the Reagan administration is kind of what you'd expect. The two main departments that are in charge of antitrust law in our country are the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. So the appointees to these departments were ideologues who went in with the job of eviscerating antitrust law. And I had the good fortune in writing Foodopoly to actually be able to interview Michael Perchuk, who had been a commissioner at the Federal Trade Commission during this period. He's retired in the Southwest today. But he told me the whole sad story about what happened to the Federal Trade Commission under James Miller, who was the appointee. You know, things you'd expect. Came in, dramatically cut the budget, got rid of whole departments, stopped the investigations going on, including one into the grocery industry. And I think most importantly, narrowed dramatically the definition of what an antitrust violation actually is. And so since that time, not only have we had very poor enforcement of the laws on the books, but we've had a definition that's so narrow that it's more difficult, much more difficult to stop mergers and acquisitions. And of course, since that time, every industry has merged and bought its competitors, and these mergers and acquisitions have just continued. And I know for young people, it's a completely different world when you've grown up in a world where there are maybe 2 or 3 competitors in every industry. But there used to be many, many competitors in every industry, and that's completely changed. Now, moving through the 1980s and into the 1990s, there were negotiations for the trade agreements, for the trade regime. And these companies that had become much larger, beginning to get bigger and bigger, began to have a lot of influence over these trade negotiations. Because what happens when a company gets bigger and bigger and bigger and merges or acquires other companies? They become very, very wealthy, right? They have a lot more resources. And so it was really during this period in the 1980s, leading up to the 1990s, that we began to see our political system be completely for sale, because companies had figured out that the best way to do business was to influence federal legislation, state legislation, the rules on the books, and they had begun to do this. And they also figured out that this was something they needed to do with both political parties, although I will say when you look at history, the Democrats are a little bit cheaper to buy. Now, moving into the 1990s with these trade negotiations, the giant grain trader Cargill, very slick company, private company, decided that they wanted to be in charge of the agreement on agriculture under the World Trade Organization. And the company knew that all of these different food and agriculture companies had a hard time getting along. They'd fight over certain details. So they decided that the best strategy was to put together a major coalition on trade. And they convened a coalition, and it was very successful. The idea was to come to agreement on really on the broader trade regime. And Cargill ended up actually writing the agreement on agriculture under the WTO, and those same provisions were adopted under NAFTA, only in NAFTA they were even worse. The North America Free Trade Agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. They were worse because they included provisions that allowed companies to sue governments, municipal governments, federal governments, which has been used numerous times. So now I've picked on Ronald Reagan, now I'm going to pick on Bill Clinton. Because what Ronald Reagan began with the evisceration of antitrust law, Bill Clinton really finished. And when the Clinton administration came into office, there were, for instance, 50 large media companies, and the consolidation had already begun, but there were still 50 companies. By the time the Clinton administration was over, after its second term, there were 5 large media companies left. And what happened in the media industry began to snowball in many industries, and especially in the food industry, in meat packing, in the grocery industry. And remember, Bill Clinton was from Arkansas and had some companies that who had his ear, from Tyson, the giant meat company, to Walmart. And so the Clinton administration helped usher in those trade agreements. And once the trade agreements, the U.S. became a party to the trade agreements, then there was a lot of pressure from these same economic interests to completely get rid of the last vestiges of those New Deal farm programs. And so there was a farm bill called Freedom to Farm in 1996. And it's dangerous to put freedom, in front of any name related to legislation in Congress, right? Usually it's a bad thing. So this legislation took 2 years to pass, but it did away with what was left of the programs that helped farmers make the cost of production, which had already been really severely weakened. It put millions of acres of marginal land back into production, and it got rid of the grain reserve, even though the grain reserve had actually made money. And it completely deregulated farm policy. Very soon, farmers were calling freedom to farm, freedom to fail. Because what happens when you take away any of the policy mechanisms that stop overproduction? Each farmer wants to make the most of his land and his equipment because he knows that prices are going to be very, very, very low. So they do plant fence row to fence row. And that's really been the case ever since then. And within 2 years, we were losing many, many farms. And there was a lot of political pressure, of course, on legislators. So rather than reinitiating some of those common sense policies, they created programs that basically became a subsidy system that would prop up the commodity system, but not really allow most farmers to even make a decent living, would allow only a very small number at the top that were very, very large to make a good living. In fact, the last time the USDA did a survey, they do it every 10 years, an agricultural survey, a mid-sized farmer made in take-home pay about $19.2 thousand, and half of that was from a government subsidy. So one of the things that we usually don't discuss, and we probably will lose a lot of those subsidies if there is a farm bill, is that when farmers go out of business, that larger entities pick them up, or the land goes into development. So it's going to take a lot more than getting rid of subsidies to actually reform agriculture. And in fact, just getting rid of subsidies probably will drive a lot of farmers deeper into debt, even with the higher ethanol prices. The cost of farming has skyrocketed so much because of the consolidation and the high price of the inputs that are necessary for farming, from seeds to gasoline and equipment. So there were some beneficiaries, though, of these changes in policy. And let's think about who was really pushing for overproduction for the last 40 or 50 years. Well, the grain traders like overproduction. The food processing industry likes, to have cheap inputs. Those are the primary industries that benefit. The meat industry likes cheap feed. So there was a complete restructuring of our food system after 1996, and things were already going the wrong direction. Let's look at the meat industry. Today we have in every category of meat and dairy a very small percentage of companies that control the entire industry. So this is a heavy dairy industry. I think here in New York, even though your dairy farmers aren't making a very good living, We have one giant company, Dean, that controls 40% of conventional milk, 60% of organic milk, and 90% of soy milk. And overall, Dean and 4 co-ops that actually operate like corporations control about 75% of milk production in this country. Beef, we have 4 companies that control 80% of beef production. And we could go right down the line. Hogs are a good example of how those changes in commodity production actually made it possible for factory farming to become very economically viable. So traditionally, right, the number of animals on a farm was limited by the amount of feed you could grow because it was too expensive to buy feed. But once all of that cheap corn and soy was available, there was plenty of cheap feed. In the first couple of years, the meat industry made about $4 billion extra just from having cheap feed. And pork production went from, in 1992, where 30% of hogs were raised on factory farms, to 2004, when 80% of hogs were raised on factory farms, to 2007, the last time of the agricultural census, when 95% of hogs were raised on factory farms. And I dare say that probably that number is even higher today. The soda industry made a couple $2 billion at those first couple of years because they need cheap corn. And so it was really beneficial to those companies that were lobbying really for decades to get rid of the basic supply management policies that are really wonky and nobody pays any attention to or knows about, but really help at least keep things a little bit in closer alignment. So today, we have ended up with 20 food companies that own 60% of the brands in the grocery store. 20 food companies. The top 5 are PepsiCo, Kraft, Nestle, Tyson, and the giant Brazilian meat company JBS that owns brands like Swift. And these giant food processing companies have figured out how to do niche marketing, and of the 20 largest, 14 of those giant companies own the largest organic brands as well. They figured out how to do niche marketing for different segments of the population. They figured out how to work with food scientists to use a recipe of fat, sugar, and salt to actually addict people to junk food, foods that are bad for them. And you probably have seen a lot of the writing this year about using fat, sugar, and salt, how it triggers a hormone in the brain that actually does addict people, just like a drug. And you drive by your favorite junk food restaurant, or you walk by the cabinet where your favorite junk food is, and you literally begin to salivate. It changes the whole brain chemistry. And these ruthless companies worked with scientists to actually figure this out. And, you know, just about any policy that's related to food, the food industry and agribusiness has been able to influence our federal regulatory agencies. So the pesticides we're exposed to, advertising is a good one. The average child sees just under 5,000 junk food ads every year on television. And they've figured out that a child at the age of 3 has brand identification, begins to get brand identification. And the goal of these big food processing companies is to get a child to identify with a brand, because they know that once there is loyalty to a brand in a child, that when they become an adult, they continue to buy that brand. So it's a very draconian way of differentiating the market between these companies. And they also know that children are a big factor in what the family purchases, which is why so much junk food, look at all those sweet cereals, are placed at eye level in the grocery store. And all of those games, all of those toys in fast food directed at getting children to lobby their parents to go and get that junk food. But even these food processing companies are not the most powerful segment of the food chain. Really on top of the food chain is the grocery industry. And the grocery industry has changed dramatically over the last 15 years since Walmart got into the business. Today, 1 out of 3 grocery dollars is spent at Walmart. And the Walmart heirs have as much wealth as the bottom 40% of Americans. I mean, is that a metaphor for our food system and for our economic system? And Walmart has figured out how to basically suck all the profit up from the ground, literally from the farm field, all the way through the distribution chain into their coffers. And the other giant chains are copying. And the 3 other large chains are the Kroger brands and Costco and Target. So 3 out of the 4 weren't even in the grocery business a decade and a half ago. And the Walmart style begins with having huge volume. So Walmart needs, on average, 1 billion pounds of beef every year. They don't want to deal with a bunch of smaller food processing or meat processing companies. You know, they like dealing with Tyson and JBS. And contracts with Walmart are non-negotiable. And for a food processing company, even though they're very powerful, the food that Walmart buys is a very important part of their market share, and they need Walmart. They want Walmart to be a customer. So Walmart has tremendous influence over packaging, and Walmart every year expects lower prices, and they demand high volume discounts. So there's a continuing drive for higher and higher volume at a lower and lower price. Companies that do business with Walmart are required to use the data and logistics systems that Walmart has. So they have to track their products using radio frequency tags, very expensive to purchase, millions of dollars. They have to use the type of crates, not just the packaging, but actually the way that the food is brought into the store. The suppliers have to follow their product from their manufacturing plant all the way to the Walmart shelf. And if they're late, if there's a disruption in the chain, they get fined. It's a very draconian system. And, you know, I kind of wondered in writing Foodopoly what kind of effect it's had on fruits and vegetables. Because, you know, we know a lot about how bad the meat industry has become, but we don't hear much about what's happened in fruits and vegetables. Well, we do know that a big percentage of the food that we eat today is imported, as much some years as 50% of value. And we know that produce is one of the food products that is most commonly imported. So I went to the Central Valley of California, where the largest produce farms in the country are, and got to talk to some shippers and packers and people growing produce. And you know, in the Central Valley of California, a small farm can be 1,000 acres. I mean, we're talking about vast acreage. And what's happening is, because of that demand for volume, there is so much pressure on these growers that they're either going out of business or they're further consolidating. A grower has to have a relationship with one of the giant shippers and packers. And the giant shippers and packers are often underwritten by hedge funds. They have to be very heavily capitalized. They have to be near an airport. They have to have a relationship with a company from overseas, either ownership or contract, because a very high percentage of food will be actually imported. And you know, they tell us it's about seasonality, but it's gone way beyond seasonality. It's really about where the product can be purchased the cheapest. So it's had a real chilling effect even in the areas of the country where we're growing the most fruits and vegetables. And remember, in California, they have pretty perfect weather for fruits and vegetables, and they have a vast network of piping where river water and lake water is stolen from the northern part of the country and sent down to the Central Valley. And in fact, they want to build 2 huge tunnels today, basically rerouting the Sacramento Valley down for agribusiness and development. But anyway, there's all this water and great weather. So it's kind of hard to fathom how, without a change, pretty dramatic change, how farmers, let's take for example Iowa or Nebraska, they can't really compete with California. So a lot of what we hear about how conventional farmers just aren't willing to change to growing fruits and vegetables, we kind of have to use our common sense and think about why that might not be workable. And only 1/3 of farms in the U.S. are actually near any urban area to do any direct marketing. And direct marketing works really well for farmers who are near an urban area who can go to a farmer's market, which is a great thing, but it's not going to solve the problems in our food system. So I know everybody's looking really bummed out, and I've spent, 45 minutes or something talking about how rotten everything is. And I didn't really write Foodopoly and go around the country talking about it to just bum people out. Really, I did it kind of as a wake-up call that we're going to need to do more if we want to fix our food system than just work on it locally. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't work on it locally, because of course we should. It's great what a local food system can do for the farmers who can enjoy it, to the people who can go to the farmers market or join the CSA. It's great community building, wonderful community building. But we don't want to kid ourselves that this is enough, that this is the way we're going to change the food system from the ground up. We need people to take a further step and to actually get involved in the political system. And I think we see that here in New York, right? Where people are really taking that further political step to stop fracking. And I think it's issues like fracking, it's issues that are hot in the community that actually offer people a way to get into the political system. And really, we need people to get involved in politics. There is no shortcut to fixing our democracy. We have to do that organizing, and that organizing really starts, right, community by community. The right wing took over the country, running people for school board and dog catcher. And they had a lot of funding, but we have a lot of people and a lot of people with a lot of good energy, and we can make a difference when people get involved. And I think the fracking issue here in New York is a good example. Not that we've won completely, but Governor Cuomo has now been held off 2 years against the enormous power and money of the gas and oil industry. And I think that's what it's going to take in food, the people who are really enthusiastic about food. I think we need to begin that organizing, getting people to vote with that fork, then to vote with that vote, and to hold the people we elect accountable. And I would say, especially the Democrats who are not being accountable to their base on fracking, on food issues, on any number of issues. We're going to have to be tougher. But we need to get people involved in the issues of the day. And I'm really excited about a lot of things that I've seen as I've been traveling around the country with Foodopoly. In fact, rather than being really discouraged, I feel really encouraged by everything that I've seen. All of the organizing on genetic engineering. I mean, I never thought I would see the day that in 30 states around the country, we would have activists out getting bills introduced to label genetically engineered food. That would actually have a bill pass in Connecticut, that a bill will pass in Vermont, that the feds are now talking about there's going to have to be federal legislation. I mean, this is all a result of people getting busy in their community and organizing. And everywhere I go, people are mad, and they want to know how to get involved, and they want to get involved in their communities and take our political system back. And I think that's what we have to do. So I think with that, we will have some discussion. Comments, questions?
How are milk prices set?
Well, you know, I think it's pretty complicated, and nothing's more complicated than dairy prices, but we do know that dairy prices are being they're being manipulated on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. We know that there are that cheese is how the price is set of dairy products. I kind of go into this in Foodopoly, and I think that we do know what's happening. The question is, how do we stop that kind of manipulation, where you have 3 or 4 large users of milk basically manipulating the price of dairy, and where, you know, it's very complex because you have dairy pricing for different parts of the country. And so I think it's not a matter of knowing, it's a matter of building the political power to actually change these things. And that a lot of it has to begin with regulating the financial services industry, because so much of what is happening with commodities, with dairy prices, really has to do also with that deregulation of the financial services industry and the real abuse that's going on in Wall Street and in other trading markets. So,
just wanted to get your comment on that processed chicken can be shipped to China and processed, or chicken that has been slaughtered can be shipped to China and processed and then shipped back to the United States.
Well, you know, poultry is a really, really sad story, and the consolidation has made it much, much worse. And allowing Chinese chicken back into the country has been in the works now for about 7, 8 years. And it is the goal of allowing companies like Tyson and Purdue to move their operations to China to produce the birds and then to send them back. So that's what's behind it. They've also been very effective in lobbying for this deregulation of inspection. So today we have 175 birds a minute being slaughtered. 175 a minute, it's mind-boggling, right? So obviously those can't really be inspected. So then they use chemical washes, trisodium phosphate washes, and chlorine. And that's part of what's happened to chicken. And I think what we can do about it is we've actually been doing this at Food and Water Watch the last few years. We've been trying to put pressure on the USDA through congressional hearings and getting members of Congress to actually call the administration on it. And actually it's been worse under the Obama administration. We had stopped Chinese chicken under the Bush administration. But you know what happens when a Democrat gets into office? People are a lot less willing to push. The base is a lot less willing to push on an issue like this. And so Congress, people like Rosa DeLauro has been very active in fighting back against this. And I know one of the things that we're doing at Food and Water Watch is we're doing Fit to Eat, and we're concentrating on the poultry industry. Because I would say if there's one meat industry that is most abusive, it's the poultry industry. And you can almost be assured that the people who raise the birds are treated like serfs, make $12,000 to $15,000 a year. And that the feed that the animals are being raised with contains probably at the least antibiotics, but often arsenic as well to make that nice rosy color in the meat.
You know, what sort of policy changes do you think should happen?
We could begin with a look back, a congressional look back at what the effect has been of consolidation on every sector of our economy. Food, we could look at all of the different industries and what has happened. We could look really look at the economy, right? What's really caused the loss of jobs? We could do a review of trade policy. We need to renegotiate all of these trade agreements, and we certainly shouldn't be joining another trade agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that is designed to take away even more health and safety protections, or the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement that's designed to destroy the precautionary principle in Europe. Those would be some real easy policy things. You know, I think we need to get money out of politics. I mean, that's probably the first thing that we need to do. We need a constitutional amendment that overturns Citizens United and that actually does more than just overturning Citizens United. And then we need to fix the nuts and bolts of the supply management problems that we have. We need to have programs that help young farmers get into farming. We need to have resources that go into the research for organic farming and a lot of the challenges there are. For instance, we just stopped allowing antibiotics in the producing organic apples and fruits that have been grandfathered in. It's good that it's out, but there hasn't been any research to help the people actually trying to grow these fruits. So I actually go through in Foodopoly about a whole chapter listing just the beginning of the policies to change our food system. But I think the tough part, right, is building the political power to actually do the things that need to be done. And I think politics and money is probably first on the list.
I just recently became aware of a book, The Skeptical Environmentalist, where the author points out that if you look at the average, any measure of the standard of living across cultures across the world, it's all improved over the last centuries, over the last decades, and continues to improve. Longevity, buying power, health care, everything else is all going up in a positive direction. So how do you put this in that?
Well, I think I would pretty much disagree with that. I mean, we have more hungry people in the world today than we did 20 years ago. And I think, I'm familiar with that book, although I haven't read it. I think there's a particular political persuasion that's going with that argument. And, you know, we're not doing the things to improve people's health and nutrition. We're forcing, in other countries, peasant farmers to join the dollar economy so that they make $1 or $2 a day, right? And they are a new market for corporations. And we're not putting our resources into preventing disease. There's a lot of money going into creating drugs, and you know, we have a whole medical economy that's going on about disease. I think the quality of life, the indicators for quality of life, are actually going down in many, many places. And I think what's happening internationally, where the trade agreements and other economic pressures are forcing peasant farmers into urban areas to live in shanty towns where there aren't the kind of water services, where they're working long hours, where their children aren't able to go to school. I mean, we've seen massive movement in countries across Africa into having privatized education. So I disagree with the premises of that book, and I think we want a different kind of society, one that's based on sharing the fruits of society, not in redistributing them to the top 1%, which we're doing across the world. Here we have growing massive stratification where there's been a complete shift so that, about 0.5% owns about 50% of the wealth in this country. I mean, that's a pretty shocking statistic.
A few years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing 60, 70 local farmers. And this was not had anything to do with their finances, but it would come up in the conversation. And quite a few of them are working 2 or 3 other jobs in order to have the privilege of losing it at farming. Third generation farmer says that they've always never borrowed money. They've always been ahead of the game. He says, I can now foresee losing the farm. And but what gets me is that if these people leave the farm, you can't just plug another person in later. There's so much knowledge. Often the interviews would take place in the shop, and they're building stuff from scratch. Things they don't teach you in Cornell.
That's right. A lot of things they don't teach you.
I think we got to work hard to keep the small farms we have.
Well, we do, and that's one of the things that's so distressing is there's a lot of focus just on subsidies. In fact, a place at the table, says things about subsidies that aren't necessarily, they're not the biggest issue. It's an unfair system. It's not the biggest chunk of money, and we're going to lose farmers. And we need those farmers to transition. And so we have to have a way to kind of have common cause with people in agriculture, not demonize them, because the real problems are those economic interests that are benefiting from these bad policies, not to blame it on the farmers, which is being done. I think, just because it's technical and, we're an urban society, so people don't really know the details. There are too many of them.